seems that the government is very much focused on infrastructure, is high on the priority. But how would you characterize the state of the policy? It seems to me at the same time that there's a lot of issues that are not decided yet and are still in discussion. You have to pursue.
Well, I just wrote for myself and maybe for the audience just few numbers which already exist in the form of state support. And I should say that you are quite right, it is already quite substantial. There are special subsidies for создание казенных предприятий, где местные авиаперевозки носят социальный характер и не являются предметом коммерческой эффективности. So this would stand for government SPVs which get dotation from federal budget if their existence is not commercially viable. The annual spending last year was 2.246 billion rubles, which is slightly below $100 million. There is also some cash which airport sector is getting through FCP on state security. It's around $104 million. There are also means of indirect support. Government is subsidizing air connectivity, air flights between Central Russia and the Far East. In 2011, they spent 2.56 billion rubles on that. It does not go directly into airports, it goes to the air companies itself. But some of this money definitely is staying in the airports as well. And there are also two large FCP, federal goal-oriented programs. There is FCP for развитие транспортной системы до 2015 года, and another FCP for modernization of unified system of organization of air trafficking in Russia, also until 2015. And within this FCP, there is extra cash which can be channeled to airport sector. However, there is a big question how exactly the sector is going to be discussing with the government how they are getting this money. Because one of the issues which was raised yesterday when Collegia was discussing the legislative process, the minister and a number of members of the Collegia were very disappointed that a law on airports again was not submitted to the Duma. And there was a big discussion that this law has been discussed for many years, but it never made it to the parliament. And
do we actually need this law? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, this was exactly the question which the minister asked yesterday. He said that if the sector doesn't do anything to provide us with a professional law, and he said that he does not see a professional industry association which can be a partner to the ministry to discuss this law, then he said that basically let's quit it. Let's just regulate airports through Воздушный кодекс and forget the law on airport infrastructure. However, from my personal opinion, as an expert working with other infrastructure, I think it will be a hugest mistake, because you can see that now people who develop automotive roads, they have their own legislation which allows them to get extra cash into road trafficking. Railroad people are starting to develop their legislation. There has been Putin's decision in February in Kemerovo, in which they are going to change the concessional law, hopefully, which will allow to get extra cash into the railroad sector. And I think in order for airport industry to start receiving further means of government support, there should not only be this law, there should also be maybe not even one, maybe a number of professional industry associations who can professionally discuss with the future cabinet of ministers how exactly do you get this cash for infrastructure. Because I think political will is there. I think both from the security reasons, both from the point of view of the large-scale events which we are going to have, like Olympics and other ones, and some of the election obligations which Vladimir Putin has made, I think they have this intention. It's a question of whether airport people are going to be the ones who will get this cash. Because, for example, yesterday there was a big debate that there should be the main priority should be metropolitan metro investment, and internal city electric rail investments should be a priority. So, of course, there will be competition between different means of transport infrastructure who would like to be getting this cash for themselves. And I think it's a big question to the actually community who is present in this room. How exactly do you structure yourself in order to professionally get this political intention of the government, which can be transformed into dollars?
You mentioned that the state's putting up significant amounts of money for the investment, but as far as I understand, going forward, the financing of all this work is going to be a mixed system. So you've already got some airports like Sochi, which sold to Deripaska, you've got private owners, you've got privatization possibilities, PPP as well. How do you think this will, particularly privatization and PPP, the prospects for those for developing the sector?
Well, I would make a clear distinction between privatization and how the airports are going to be financed. If I may, I would probably start with financing ways of airports. I think basically there will be three sources. First source is private capital. Second source is direct government subsidies in the form of FCP or some other ones. And the third issue is a mixture of both. For example, I looked at the program, and in the morning you had a representative of VTB. VTB can be a very important actor and a very important player in the investment in infrastructure, as well as most other Russian banks which belongs to the government, including Sberbank, Gazprombank, VTB, and other ones. And the question is how exactly means of cash distribution will be fixed. I think for private investors, the main issue at the moment is how transparent is government tariff policy, and whether this tariff policy for airport services does include investment component. Whether you actually build up tariff just based on the current profitability of an airport, or you do include motivation for the private investor to invest extra cash in his own airport. If this mechanism is fixed, and it's a question of just not even law, it's a question of regulatory decision of Mintrans and постановление правительства, then private investors will be more excited to invest their private cash in airports. Of course, PPP legislation and the way PPP is done can be also big support for that. But I think if we speak about direct government subsidies, it's a large question how exactly the dialogue between the sector and the government is built. Speaking about privatization, I'm quite certain that privatization will continue. I sit on a board of other companies which belong to the government and who are being constantly privatized. But it's not, at the moment for the government, it's not the task to privatize it just for the sake of privatization. I think privatization of certain airports will be, or government stock in certain airports will be happening if the government will really understand that from the sales, they will keep the infrastructure running. So basically, they will not be privatizing airports in order for them to go bankrupt, most likely for sure. They would rather keep them in the state ownership. So they will understand, they will need to see an interested professional investor who want to develop an airport. And second, they would definitely look for cash. You can look, I think here airports will be not much different how government is trying to privatize stock of Sberbank or some other governmentally owned stock. But the presence of institutional investor is important.
But at the moment, though, at the moment, we're basically talking about a state-funded program. I mean, the involvement of private investors in particularly the airport sector is still right at the beginning, isn't it?
Well, I think if you look at players like Novaport, Basel Aero, some other Renova, some other big groups. Private investors are already there. It's a question of them comparing airport business with some other business opportunities which they have. Because, for example, owner of Basel Aero can compare his cash returns on other businesses, etc. And it's a question of, as I said earlier, government deregulating tariffs and making them transparent from the investment point of view. If I'm a private investor and I want to invest in Russian airport, I want to be certain that within 5 and even better 10-year time, I will be getting stable cash returns on my investments. I don't want to invest in a Russian airport and then find out that the regional REC, because they changed their mind or something like that, are going to completely reconsider all my investment plans. So if the government decides to regulate tariffs for airport services, then it should be setting up transparent rules for private investors. And if that happens, I'm sure there will be a boost of private investors in the sector, and it will be increasing dramatically. Just a question of establishing transparent rules of the game. And don't forget also, web is also full of cash. They have government task to develop infrastructure. It's a question of them going together with private investor if these rules if the sector will be becoming more transparent. But I think the airport sector community itself should play a real strong role voicing their opinions, not only at conferences like such, but also through lobbying organizations which work with government and Russian regions.
How significant is this kind of investment for the economy? I cite the US State Department, Treasury Department did a study where they found $1 invested into roads returns $6 in terms of GDP. I mean, the underlying infrastructure in Russia is there, it works, but it needs upgrading. Do you think, with all this spending that's going into infrastructure, what significance and impact is it going to have on the economy?
You definitely, when you invest in airports, you definitely have a dramatic multiplicative effect for the whole development of Russian regions. And in my opinion, this should be another strong lobbying argument for airport lobby to come to discuss future investments from the state, especially when you speak to regional administrations, because there is a number of Russian regions who are quite cash rich. I mean, they are not all 83, unfortunately there is slightly more than 10, but inside these regions you can also have regional administration who would be quite open hearing how good it is to develop your local airports, not just for the airport itself, but for the whole development of the economy. Unfortunately, at the moment, personally, I have not come across recent studies who calculate professionally regional effectiveness or бюджетная эффективность of budgetary effectiveness of airport development in certain regions. If there are any studies of different companies, I would be very interested to get them myself. I don't think American figures can be directly applied to Russia because from the point of view of transport system in Russia, it's very different from America. So I think for Russia, we will have definitely different figures. Most likely they will be lower than American figures because in Russia you have to remember rail, you have to remember road transport as well, so our port is something extra. But still there is a big multiplicative effect and also a large image effect. I like to give this example. I have been invited by governor of Perm to come to the forum in Perm, for which they spend a lot of money, and I have been a speaker at their plenary session, and when I came to through the airport, I had to spend 3 hours in the airport terminal because of the security inspection. And for the image of Russian regions, our poor airports are really terrible. And you actually see government being ready to fix that when they do this, you know, Olympic Games and a lot of other stuff. Also about the local airport, I have just read in a study of Внешэкономбанк that the airport capacity of Vladivostok for ATES is going to be around 5 million passengers per year. However, in reality, Vladivostok needs only 1.5. And it's a big question, when exactly do they need 5 million? And whether it will not be too expensive to heat up and to use this airport with such great capacity. And I heard also, I'm sure Basel colleagues might correct me, but I heard that Basel Aero had a similar discussion with Russian Olympstroy, how big they really want to have the airport in Sochi. So I think on one hand it's very good that government is through this mega events. And actually there is ATES in 2012, there is Universiada in Kazan 2013, there is Sochi 2014, there is Football Cup, there is also Formula in 2014, there is Football Cup in 2018. So it looks like Putin every year is trying to build up a new sport event to boost infrastructure, and to me it's very much similar, like he started to move a lot of forums to St. Petersburg to make St. Petersburg a new kind of, economic capital of Russia. But if you ask St. Petersburg people themselves, are they happy with so many events happening in the St. Petersburg? Many of them will say that St. Petersburg Economic Forum for them is a nightmare because they cannot move around the city, hotels go extremely high with prices, etc. So I would definitely use that as a sector, but I definitely would not count on it for sustainable development of Russian infrastructure. And in Russia, unfortunately, we love to make things big. As we say, we are a country of largest cannon which never shoot and the largest bell which never rang. So I really hope that these large infrastructure projects will not be following this tradition, but they will be used by both business, local authorities and federal government to really develop new mechanisms of infrastructure development.